So today I'm super excited to have some, like we said, legendary fire scientists here. And to help me moderate this call, I'll hand it over to my project partner, Dr. Sonia Leverkus, who has been working together with myself, the Peace River Forge Association, and Dr. Jillian Baynard on a prescribed fire project that we're working on here in the Peace region. So, Sonia, welcome to the team.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia, and a big thank you to the Peace River Forage Association. We're really excited to see all the folks here on the call, and we'll recognize a few folks here as I see people entering the chat. Nadia and I would particularly like to acknowledge that we're both speaking to and sharing this land that's Treaty 8 traditional territory and lands important to Casca and Métis communities, and that we all share this responsibility for this beautiful country and for the four-leggeds and all of the livestock and wildlife over the next 7 generations. So we hope that this information that we share today can also help with everybody's thinking around fire, good fire. We would like to acknowledge Dr. Jillian Baynard, who I see she's on the call here. There she is. And from Agriculture Canada as one of our research partners. Thank you so much, Jillian, for being on the call. Also on this call, I see there's wildfire folks from the Northwest Territories and from BC Wildfire Service, and a lot of folks from the Fort Nelson area and from our team here at Shifting Mosaics and Northern Fireworks. So thank you for joining us. Without further ado, we would like to introduce Dr. Sam Fuhlendorf. He can let us know who he is and what he currently does, and what he knows about Northeast British Columbia. I can also say that I've known Sam since 2009, I think, and had the privilege of being part of his lab at Oklahoma State University, and he was my advisor for my PhD. So, Dr. Sam Fuhlendorf, over to you for 3-minute intro.
Thank you, Sonia. And I don't know that I need 3 minutes, but I'll start talking and see where it goes. I, uh, First of all, I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to. I can't think of a better place to talk about than British Columbia. So it's a great opportunity, and I'm happy to be here. Um, I'm originally from Texas, and that's where I went to school. And I basically sort of got a degree. My undergrad degree was in agriculture, and then my grad work was in um, rangeland ecology, studying mostly grazing at that time. But one of the things I realized when I was studying grazing is that most of the things that everyone was upset about were most of the things were associated with fire more than they were with grazing. So I started almost immediately working on fire as well, um, and then had the opportunity of working with Dave, and we were both interested in some of the same things. So we started working on fire as well. And it's kind of funny because I go to fire meetings, and oftentimes the fire people will call me a grazing person. And when I go to grazing meetings, they think I'm a fire person. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but I kind of like that place because I think we have to talk about both of them simultaneously, whether we're talking about wild animals or domestic. So I've had a great deal of fun with my career, and I'm happy to talk about it today. And I think that I'll stop there.
Sam, one other question. What do you know about Northeast BC?
Oh, I have followed Sonia around up there several times, and I know a lot about it. I wish I knew more. I wish I could spend more time up there. It's an amazing place with wonderful people. Um, I am not too sure about the bears that Sonia always tries to scare me over, but it's still even with the bears, it's a wonderful place. So I hope I answered that okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Sam. Uh, and over to Dr. Dave Engle, who also was at Oklahoma State University. I had the great pleasure of having Dr. Engle on our committee, and along also with Sam, being good friends with him. So Dave, would you let us know who you are, what your experience is with prescribed fire, and anything you'd like to share about Northeast BC?
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. And I'll echo what Sam said about this being an honor to be with you guys, to be invited to participate. So I do know a little bit about Northeast BC because I was on Sonia's PhD committee. And then in 2016, been a long time now, I with John Weir, came to Northeast BC and toured that area, helped teach prescribed burning class, and really was amazed at that landscape and the role that fire has played there. Uh, so my background is I'm a native of New Mexico, which is a southwestern state in the U.S., and uh, went to college in Texas, where I was fortunate enough to work as a student uh, under Dr. Henry Wright, who at that time was the premier wildland fire ecologist in the U.S. And together with Dr. Art Bailey, a Canadian, wrote the Fire Ecology of the U.S. and Canada, just a classic book. So it was really my introduction to prescribed burning. I had fought fire on a U.S. Forest Service fire crew for summers while I was an undergraduate student. So I was around wildland fire, but never around prescribed burns. And that was really my introduction. And I've, like Sam kind of overviewed our connection together, really fortuitous because it was a really dynamic, powerful way to combine fire and grazing. And I grew a lot through that experience as well.
Thank you, Dave. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for being here with us as well. How exciting, very exciting discussion that we'll have. Our third, but not the least presenter for today is Dr. Derek Scasta. I had the great pleasure of completing my PhD alongside of Dr. Scasta as he was completing his PhD at Oklahoma State as well. And Dr. Scasta has also been on our team here at Shifting Mosaics, along with doing the pile of research with us. So Derek, who are you? What is your experience in prescribed fire, and what do you know about Northeast BC?
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. Well, as has been said, it is a pleasure and honor to be with you all today and talk about fire and grazing. So there's a theme. I'm from Texas as well, and my first exposures to fire were wildfires, where conditions were not very nice, and we were trying to put those fires out. And I started my career working with ranchers as an extension agent, kind of consultant, outreach type, and was focused a lot on grazing and wildlife. And then I moved counties, and some of my ranchers were talking about a wildlife biologist we had who was wanting to burn in the name of habitat improvement. So I got to know that wildlife biologist, got to start to do some burning with him and these ranchers, and just thought it was the coolest thing in the world, where we had folks interested in rangelands and forests and livestock production and good fire that had a real purpose and some real objectives to it. So I went back to grad school, and that's where I met Sonia, Sam, and Dave, and they're all three of my heroes in many ways. I look up to them a lot and have learned a lot from them. When I was in Oklahoma, I spent a lot of time with someone else who's been mentioned, John Weir, and just tried to go with him everywhere to burn, and got to burn in prairies and shrub dominated systems. And then I moved to Wyoming, and I've been in Wyoming for going on 11 years. And Wyoming's a funny place because it's where the plains really meet the mountains. And there's a diversity of opinions about fire and the use of prescribed fire. Um, and as part of my experience, we started a prescribed fire council here in Wyoming. And we have a lot of land that's publicly owned, about half the state. So we have private landowners, we have public land managers, and a lot of opinions about how we should do things, when and where. And it's been good to engage with them at different levels, policy and procedures. And we just came off of a big wildfire year this last year, which always gets folks talking again about fire and fuels management. And so I've been fortunate to burn across 4 states, a bunch of vegetation types. We've got some really proactive fire managers here. We're lighting fires with drones and helitorches, as well as drip torches as well. And I've never been to Northeast BC, but here's what I do know. It's very rural. And Wyoming is the least populated state in the US. And so I think there's a lot of similarities where we're kind of 1 or 2 deep on things. So our ranchers are often the volunteer fire department. They'll have a truck parked, in the barn, and they are the first responder. So that intersection of ranching and fire management is very intimate here. And that's a pretty real dynamic. And the other thing is we have a lot of similar dynamics like wolves and bears, big mountains, forests, and then open park areas and brush dominant areas, and then prairies. So, it's always been good to work with Sonia and think about those similarities. And it's on my list to get to Northeast BC, hopefully meet some of the producers there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Derek. And for those on the phone or on the line who know about the Peace Liard Prescribed Fire Program, Derek was one of the co-authors of that in 2018 and 2019 as well. So thank you all for your intros. I just wanted to also share with Dave, Sam, and Derek, we have folks from oil and gas companies like Siobhan Erskine on the phone. We have a lot of folks from the range program, from the BC range program that I see here, as well as producers. So you're speaking to a broad audience when you respond. I think we'll turn it over to Sam first so just so the folks know, we've got some questions that we're going to go through for the next 25 minutes or so. And as Nadia has said in the chat, please ask your questions. Nadia is going to be facilitating the chat. So Sam, and then maybe Dave can follow up. Sam, what is pyric herbivory? What does pyric herbivory and patch burn grazing mean to you? Or maybe you could define it for us.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. So pyric herbivory, so patch burning is typically what we call the management practice of pyric herbivory, which pyric herbivory is sort of something that may or may not be a part of management. So it's a sort of distinction, but in reality, they're pretty much the same thing. And the main idea is the specific definition of the word is that it's grazing that's driven by fire. So the idea is to try and recouple fire and grazing. We've decoupled them and largely tried to suppress all fires, and we wanted to recouple them. And by that, meaning that animals would have the ability to select between areas that have been burned or areas that haven't been burned in quite a few years. And so allowing the animals to choose where to forage is the general sort of basic principle behind the concept. And it came about largely from, the Native Americans knew this long ago. So we basically just rediscovered what they long ago knew, and is that animals are actually attracted to fires. And so it sort of removes the idea that you have to have fuel or forage. You can actually have both. And so the animals are attracted to recently burned areas, and then the recently burned areas move around the landscape. And it allows for, over many years, you have full distribution and full use, but at any given point in time, you have areas that are being heavily grazed and areas that aren't being grazed at all. And this variability is what's critical to sort of understanding these grassland systems. And I guess one more point is that when I came to OSU, Dave Engle and I also work a lot with Bob Hamilton, who runs the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and they were already doing it. So I often get a lot of credit for it, but in reality, Bob was doing it. It just wasn't formalized. So no one had really collected a lot of data, and there wasn't an attempt to try and understand what was actually happening. So between the Native Americans here and Bob Hamilton, in reality, I get credit for something that I mostly stole, but I have enjoyed studying it in a lot of different contexts, and I look forward to talking more about it. And I think I'll let Dave take over from there.
Yeah, well, it's hard to follow that because I think Sam hit on all the pertinent points. But one of the things I like to say about patch burn grazing or pyric herbivory is emphasize Sam's point is that it combines the two and their interaction in a really powerful way. I think maybe one way to think about it is that it allows us as managers to really direct the incidents and the behavior of both fire and grazing animals. And if you think about that, that's pretty powerful. If we don't do that, we don't do pyric herbivory or patch burn grazing, then we lose the ability largely to direct one or the other of those. And so, or at least we constrain the ability for that. So it is really a powerful way to leverage your management on landscapes. And we can say a little bit more about that, Sam, as questions come on. I think I'll leave it at that.
Before we pass it over to Derek here, Sam and Dave, you both mentioned grasslands, grazing animals, prairie. Are those the only ecosystems that pyric herbivory occurs in? And could you also share, perhaps, we've got Mike Gravel, who leads the Northwest Territories wildfire program, where there may not be the typical prairies in the Northwest Territories, and we've got some folks from the Yukon. Are there could you just share some other types of ecosystems and maybe other types of, or the plethora of animals that are part of pyric herbivory? Whoever wants to start, go ahead.
Sam, how about giving examples from Africa? I think that just to show you how far afield this actually works or is used.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've actually had the great opportunity of going to Africa quite a few times. Also, Spain has been recently, they're really focused on it. And I would say neither one of those are prairies, neither one of those are boreal forest either. But I guess I'll also quote back to a former student, Brady Allred. He put together a table that has grown substantially since then of people who reported this pyric herbivory, although they didn't necessarily have the terminology the same, but they reported the interaction, and it was every continent except for Antarctica, and we haven't found that one yet. Just kidding. But so it's many animals that are dealing. Certainly, one common challenge is that we often think about when animals forage, we think about forage quantity, but in reality, quality is a really serious issue in many systems, and that is part of the reason that animals are so attracted to recently burned areas. And so with that in mind, There are differences among animals that in terms of their degree of selection for recently burned areas, but in general, most of them have a relatively strong selection preference for recently burned areas and the high. And we've done a lot lately of looking at all different aspects of forage quality within those burn units, and almost all of them improve dramatically, sometimes 4 or 5 fold better in a burned area than a unburned area.
Yeah, that's really good. Sam, another thing that occurs to me that you and I have talked about a lot is how managers will oftentimes substitute another tool.
Yeah.
And so they abandon maybe both grazing and fire. And an example that comes to me from a forested system is in South Carolina in longleaf pine ecosystem. And the manager there was using what's often called as heavy metal. That is, big tractors, dozers, even pulling really heavy equipment, tillage equipment to disturb the soil. And his management target was really a game bird, gallinaceous bird, northern bobwhite quail, which really thrive on substantial amounts of bare ground and forb species. And so he was doing that because the system just drives to grass dominance. And with grass dominance, the bobwhite quail populations decline. And so, Sam, that's one example where the fire grazing interaction, he was able to abandon that heavy metal approach and save a huge amount of money. I mean, for his particular plantation, it was $100,000 a year cost just for pulling that heavy metal. Can you give us any other examples, or give any other examples that might resonate, or am I pulling hat trick on you? I'm sorry if
Well,
I am.
I was wondering if maybe Derek, I have a feeling, might know of some other species where pyric herbivory exists in their life cycle. Derek, did you want to touch on
Yeah,
that?
well, I was thinking about what Dave and Sam were saying, and really good points. And the frequency and the scale of these fires matters, and of course, post fire moisture,
Yeah.
can influence so timing and the growing conditions after fires. And of course, I've thought a lot about large bovids like cattle or bison, but I think in some of the other native wildlife populations are some good examples. And when I was a grad student, I got real interested in how these animals may preferentially choose areas that have been burned and maybe they're regrowing, and thought a lot about wildlife. And there's a paper that came out of BC back in 1985, Seep and Bunnell, and it was Stone's sheep that had access to burned and unburned ranges. And they reported that those sheep that had access to burned alpine range had lower lungworm larvae counts and then higher lamb production. So, a lot of times with cattle, we're thinking about weaning weights in the fall and, production. But there's these other potential benefits as it changes, like microhabitat at very fine scales and very large scales too. And so, there's an example from right there in your backyard, with a really probably pretty iconic wildlife species.
Yeah, thank you three for your comments. And Nadia, if it's okay, I think that we could talk about Siobhan's question right now and maybe get 45 seconds from each of the panelists around your response for Siobhan, Siobhan's here in Fort Nelson and has been involved in prescribed fire with us. What role does fire size, temperature, and intensity play in the success of pyric herbivory cycles? So that's just written in the chat, and you each get 45 seconds. Oh, this is kind of like reminiscent of a PhD defense, but like the other way around. Great. You each get 45 seconds, and we'll start with Dave. Dave, what role does fire size, temperature, and intensity play in the success of pyric herbivory?
fire size and temperature, like ambient air temperature.
I think
Uh,
that's what it means, yeah.
well, I think, we've debated that. I think Sam and Derek and the rest of us have debated a size, for example. What's the minimal or maximal size? And I think one of the things that we found is it can be really small uh, extent, but also very large, depending on the animal species and maybe the ecosystem too that you're speaking about. Air temperature, cold, hot, probably the same way. I was just thinking about that. I remember I worked some in South Dakota in my earlier years, and maybe you all have seen this too, burning with snowdrifts. So you'll in spring at some point you still have snowdrifts, but in between using those. And I wondered, could you really use pyric herbivory and move patches around with snow drifting? So I don't know that we could really say there are any constraints with regard to temperature. In my view, the other guys may think differently.
Okay, Sam? Thanks.
Uh, yeah, I guess one of the things I'll do, I agree entirely with Dave. One of the things I'd do is just point to one of the studies we did with Tori Hovick. So we wanted to get at how important was the right scale of, and different seasons. So we had fires or we had pastures that were 1,000 or 2,000 acres that were divided into patches that ranged from no patches, one whole unit where we burned the whole pasture, all the way up to 8 different patches where we burned 2 a year, one in the spring and one in the summer. And so we had 1, 2, 3, 4 fire frequency or fire return interval, and then we had 2 seasons or just 1 season. And I guess the first thing I'd say is that in general, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. I mean, all of those worked. In fact, we thought that they wouldn't, but the interesting thing is that if you're interested in diversity of like birds, for example, they were lowest with 1 and highest with 8, and they just kept going up. So it was like we didn't make enough patches for it to be as diverse as we wanted. The other thing I'll just add is sort of the philosophical approach we've taken is more variability, the better as a result of that. So different seasons, different temperatures, and my argument always is that if you have 6 different patches in a pasture, then I'm 6 times less likely to be entirely wrong. Uh, so basically, by providing a lot of variability out there, if this year it's a bad year to burn in the spring, well, it's good that we only burned a small patch. And that wasn't all we did. So the idea of creating this variability helps us buffer some of our uncertainty so that we can actually be a little more secure in knowing that we're going to have a productive year.
Do you feel like that also lends itself to heterogeneity and the importance of heterogeneity across landscapes?
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's basically all I could talk about sometimes.
Thank you, Sam and Dave. Derek, would you like to touch on this, or do you want a different question to respond to?
I do have, yeah, just a thought or two. I mean, it's a little bit of an existential question to think about what is success, and really managing these dynamic systems, and that made me think about operational ability to get fires done, which can be challenging for all the reasons. Restrictions, having a big enough group of people, equipment. And so fire size can matter, in that regard. And then, temperature, especially when things get warm, folks start to get nervous. Probabilities of ignition go up and things like that. So those things do matter, but I do agree that creating a lot of different, times since an area was burned and allowing those animals to just kind of do what they do to select, different patches because their needs vary. I mean, if we just wanted to maximize weight gains of yearling cattle, well, there's a model that has been used down here where they burn in the spring. We go through what's a pretty predictable wet period, and those warm season grasses respond, and those yearling cattle they grow rapidly. But that's only one metric of success. It's putting weight on yearlings, and so oftentimes there's competing, objectives, and it may be some form of, outcome like weight gains on cattle, but maybe you've got some mule deer and you're also interested in some patches of, wooded areas for fawning habitat. And so, it really is just that diversity. And I think probably from you, Sonia, and Sam is like just not being locked into some paradigm like it is this way. And by gosh, if you don't do it that way. Now, government agencies don't like that, right? They like to simplify it and manage it. So I think that's something that producers have to advocate for. And as one example, I've got a producer here right on the Montana-Wyoming border. Right after a wildfire, he's ready to burn because he's using that boundary to burn against that wildfire scar. So while everyone else is all of a sudden risk averse, he's jumping right back in. And so, thinking outside the box is critical about all of those things because they should all vary all the time, probably.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Derek. That kind of lends itself to one thinking about shifting mosaics across the landscape and the importance of the distribution of time since fire and number of times an area has burned. On the call here, we have, I'm just going to give him a shout out, Darius Lowe, who's our district manager from the Ministry of Forests, who's responsible for the Northeast Range Program, along with many of the agrologists and range team from Northeast BC. So I think that's really exciting to have them here. Derek, this is a question that's going to, oh, and there's Darius. Thank you, Darius, for being with us. Derek, this is a question over to you, and then we can see if Darius also wants to chime in with a question in the chat about it. But Derek, what are obstacles and how have you overcome working with prescribed fire in a rangeland setting, whether that was in Texas or Oklahoma or now in Wyoming with Prescribed Burn Association?
Yeah, let me talk about Wyoming because the culture is a little different than Texas and Oklahoma, where I would say there's more of a fire culture. It's a challenge. And I think for a number of years, producers didn't understand their liability, what state law described. And so we tried to work to put that together. And it was very clear that it is an accepted agricultural practice where there's exemption at certain scales to, emissions and things like that. So that knowledge empowers them a little bit to know what is coded in the state law. What kind of due diligence do they need to do there? But it is very challenging, especially when we go into active wildfire years. I mean, we've come right out of very, very extreme wildfires and burn bans. And like the day the burn ban ended, the next day we're trying to light a fire. Well, we have to get approvals from different authorities, and you can imagine their reaction. So it does come down to education, but it's a continuous process because the other side is if we don't burn anything, we will have fire at some stage. So I manage one of our research properties. We burned a little bit, but we've had fires on it, which, by the way, the pronghorn antelope really like to go forage in as the plants recover. So I think keeping, just like you all are doing, keeping the conversation going about historical processes, what we know, I think that's critical.
Yeah, exceptional response. Thank you, Derek, very much. Sam or Dave, would either of you like to chime in here, or else we're going to go to Darius's question in the chat about riparian management zones, which I feel like Sam might like to touch on that. Dave, would you like to add to any of the obstacles or challenges and how you've overcome working with folks in prescribed fire?
Yeah, it takes some time. Derek has stated that pretty emphatically. It takes time and education, and education a lot to a great extent by experience. So people with drip torches in their hands and running spray rigs, and otherwise probably not ever going to really participate as a manager.
Yeah. Yes, I definitely agree. I think just for folks on the online, check out the Peace River Forage Association website. Nadia will probably share that in the chat at some point to show where you can attend the fire school and actually join us and get that mentorship with our team and the producers and ranchers in the Northeast who are welcoming folks to join us in our spring 2025 prescribed fires. So very true. Darius, how about you pose your question if you're in a place you can ask, and then I would volunteer Sam to start the response about riparian areas.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks to the panelists. I took this opportunity to ask this question. This is the one, as a land manager, my responsibility is I take a burn plan application and then I look at the land management objectives. And in northern BC, I don't think we ever thought we'd have a water problem, but we have a water problem in northern BC. Of course, if we're talking rangeland management for livestock, we definitely don't want livestock congregating and hanging out in riparian areas. Numbers of reasons for that. And this is a complex question. So I guess I recently had a burn plan application where they had designed the boundaries at the top of the break down to the river. And so their proposal was to burn the area up on the bench. And someone came back to me and said, well, do you care if they burn all the way down to the river edge? And I'm like, I don't know if I care. So I guess that's the question I had. That's the reason, that's the context for this is, I think we try to avoid burning riparian management areas, but I just thought I'd get your impressions being such an expert panel. So thank you.
Thanks, Darius. Sam?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, and it's not one that has been studied extensively. I can say that we've mostly done what you described, and we've mostly thought that was not the best way to go. But logistically, it creates a new problem of where's the boundary going to be. But I do think, and we've talked about it extensively, but there are other cases where, for example, out in western Oklahoma, it's drier. We have a study where we actually split the pasture up into patches that cross the riparian area. So the riparian area ran down the middle. And so every patch that we burned went through the riparian area. And what we found was that the cattle spent much less time in that treatment in the riparian area than they did where we didn't burn. So it's sort of, what do you compare it to? I do think, and we've talked about doing these studies, and we've done some of sorts where we just burn the upland to actually draw them out of the riparian area, and it does work. So I think you can use it in either way. I know that at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, Bob almost always burns off of the riparian area, and he's in an environment that seems to work pretty well, but we have often talked that it's probably a serious problem. I think we need to do more time studying how to burn uplands and actually pull cattle, or cattle at least, pull them out of the riparian areas, because I think there's a great deal of potential in doing that. And although at some point you may need to burn the riparian area too, but you might be able to do that as a separate process instead of the one that is allowing the animals to interact. I don't know if anybody else has anything they would like to add. Great question.
Dave, would you like to add anything?
Just something that Sam and I and others have talked about is that it's very possible that riparian areas and other sensitive areas also require disturbance, and really severe disturbance, if you want to use that terminology. So if you always exclude the riparian areas, you're probably not managing that ecosystem like it happened before European settlement and fire suppression, because they were burned. And some of the historical records really show that bison, for example, concentrated on those areas, and the disturbance was pretty severe. So, you know, uh, but of course they did have long periods of rest to counter that. That's just an idea. I don't, Sam, maybe that's a research topic. Both, you could do another couple of studies to examine those
Yeah.
different approaches.
Maybe another follow-up. Oh, Darius, you have a follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I mean, there's the livestock management piece, and I'm also in charge of range. So like, uh, I love the idea of prescribed fire, and I'm actually looking to use it in livestock management more effectively in protecting wildlife habitat and wildlife use of land, so drawing them away from sensitive wildlife features, drawing them away from riparian areas. That's a huge opportunity there that has been underutilized, or at least taken away from the way that we've done range management in Northeast BC. I think the second piece of that is like going another layer higher would be like the sedimentation risk, right? Like,
Right.
so these are where we've had so much catastrophic wildfires. You just had it in California as well, where you go from fighting fire to literally the next day running away from mudslides. And so that's the water quality side of it. Okay, I want to manage the livestock, but then I also don't want to have tons of flush of sedimentation
Right.
into streams as a result of me dropping the match, when I could have just let the wildfire do it, and then I wouldn't have been responsible or had liability for that. And I guess I kind of know part of the answer to my question. I think it's part of how we apply prescribed fire. We're not doing that deep soil burn to still vegetation holding stuff on. But what's your any thoughts on managing sedimentation through our operational implementation of prescribed fire?
Darius, it's a really good question. Sam, remember when we were in Montana and it was Clayton Marlowe, maybe, at
Yeah.
SRM? So actually, Darius, that's somebody we can bring on if he's still around, but we can bring his publications forward. I remember, just that makes me think about his presentation around fire and sedimentation. Sam, do you have any thoughts there?
No, I mean, only real response is that it's very true. And of course, the problem is that now we have land parcels that are of different sizes. And, it's one thing to talk about it sort of philosophically from, hundreds of years ago, but, nobody wants to drink muddy water. And, it gets real practical when you have neighbors and so forth, as well as when you consider broad things like lots of other wildlife and so forth. I do think that using wildfires as an example of what could happen is risky, just because sometimes those are quite different from a prescribed fire. But I think this fits into a category. If you think about grazing, for example, we've been studying grazing for a long time, and we know a lot about it. And it's kind of like fire. We've really not been giving that its just due until lately. And so that's one of those things that I've written down as something that would be fun to study, because I do think uh, we can find out ways to make it a little more useful. I mean, one way is to sort of just use fires to keep animals out of the riparian area, and then realize Dave's point, which is at some point we need to disturb those too, but almost keeping those two things separate might be an avenue to go down.
Sonia,
Go ahead, Derek. Yeah.
I had one thought, and I really appreciate this line of discussion. And again, it goes back to success, and we could have cattle or livestock centric, metrics of success, but there's some really interesting work on amphibians and their exposure to burned or unburned areas. And there's some evidence out of Montana that there can be a reduction in some of the fungal infections, chytrid infections in those amphibians, or an increase in growth rates in the earlier life stages because you remove some of that decadent, maybe it's sedges, rushes, other grasses, perhaps willows, and you get more sunlight, the thermal environment can change. So I agree there's concern about sediment and nutrient loading and then maybe more concentration of large animals. But when I think about the natural history of some of these other organisms, I think there's some evidence that maybe there is some time and place where there would be other benefits mutual with livestock grazing. So
I would like to ask this, totally going off script here, because Darius set us on this wavelength, which I do think will be beneficial for many of the folks on this. And it's a bit uncomfortable, but Dave, how do you define damage on rangelands? Like what would be damaging in your opinion? And Sam and Derek will ask the same thing for you too. What is damage to riparian areas, to rangelands? Like what does damage mean?
Well, it's a really question. It's complex too, because one way to respond to that is that really the way you damage a rangeland is usually with some kind of disturbance that didn't take place historically. Kind of the classic example is cultivation. So that definitely damages that. That's just not natural. And again, a lot of times there's just more examples in that South Carolina example where we substituted some other management practice that actually damages. Use of herbicides is another classic example of causing damage. So I didn't get at your definition of damage, but the causes of it. I think, just something to throw out to see what the other two guys think, but it's, in rangelands that have a history of fire and grazing, you'd be hard pressed to ever damage them with fire and grazing before you have some other kind of loss, like a loss in livestock production or maybe a key wildlife species you're managing.
Thanks, Dave. I can tell that Darius is reflecting on that, which is great. Sam, how about you? Damage.
Yeah, I think damage is kind of like the word disturbance. So, I mean, it means something to humans, but it doesn't mean much to ecosystems. I mean, it matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm saying it's part of the system. And so I think that's what Dave was getting at. It's part of the system until it's not. If you turn it upside down with a plow, that's clearly not the same system anymore. But if you're talking about a system, and I think it's one really unfortunate sort of thing about our communication of ecology is that we call grazing and fire disturbances, but they're essential to the ecosystem. So there's a lot of discussion about that kind of thing in the ecological literature that's kind of painful. It's a little bit, they'll talk about pulse versus press disturbances and those sorts of things. And so I'm not going to say that, I agree with Dave. It's hard to use grazing and fire to disturb it. I do think you can, and usually it comes from doing the same thing all the time, over and over and over and over again, having the same distribution of grazing, the same either full fire suppression or burning everything every year would be almost at the other extreme. And I'm not sure that still damage applies to that as much as we might think, but it certainly can mess up many of the ecosystem services that humans might be interested in.
Thank you, Sam. Derek? damage?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the media maybe propagates or perpetuates this idea some, and it happens here. That immediate post-fire picture it's an all-black landscape, and it's sensationalized. But the reality is that it's dynamic and it's changing through time. And so I think to really understand damage, you need trends, temporal, you know, uh, attempts to monitor that, and I think a lot about ecosystem function. Certainly, the things that I would be concerned about would be erosion, and I think understanding what soil texture, what wind and water risks you have relative to greening back up. I think the evidence is pretty clear there. The bigger risk could be very large wildfires with very extended periods of drought for a year or two after. The risk of just wind-driven erosion is really high. So prescribed fire, we can watch those forecasts a little better and adapt to maybe some of those shorter midterm forecasts. The thing that I probably get the most pushback is invasive species, where there's a niche that's now more conducive to their establishment, like annual winter grasses or some of our thistles and things like that. And does that alter function? So, yeah, we probably need a whole nother webinar for what is damage.
Yeah, yes, it's just really timely that many of us are thinking about that here in Northeast BC. So thank you three for your responses to that. Excellent. Nadia, we have 7 minutes left and we have a couple of questions. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. How would you like to proceed? Shall we ask another one of our questions?
I don't see, yeah, like you said, I don't see any additional questions. So if this discussion is spurring some questions, please don't hesitate to put them in. Maybe in the meantime, let's do one more of our questions.
Okay, excellent. So looking forward from here, Derek, Sam, and Dave, you're familiar with our ranchers and outfitters and Indigenous communities and folks who use fire and integrate fire and support fire as an ecological process. What would be some of your recommendations on how we can continue incorporating pyric herbivory, fire and grazing here in Northeast BC? What's worked well in the US or other places that you are familiar with? And we'll start with Sam because his mic is ready to go.
I was thinking that I hope Derek and Dave had the right answer to that question, but yeah, I'm not sure that I'm the right expert to talk about how to integrate that into society as well. I do think I'm biased toward needing more data all the time to make meaningful recommendations, but that's because I get paid to collect data. So maybe I'm biased in that. But I really do feel like there's a major lack of communication, like Derek mentioned, because I mean, it's one thing you have multiple audiences, so I can go out here and work with landowners and they may be eager to apply what I'm doing, but if when they burn, it ends up on the front page of the news and all negative. So I think sometimes we forget about communicating more broadly as well as communicating to landowners and people that are the actual stakeholders. There's the example of the reintroduction of the wolf in Colorado recently that I'm sure that is real controversial because all of the people who are most having to deal with it aren't the ones that voted to reintroduce the wolf. So I just think that's going to happen more and more often where rural people are having to deal not only with the problems they face, but they're going to have to deal with the public perception of those problems that go to the masses that are actually the people that may scream the loudest and influence the policies that come down. So I hate to sound stereotypical, and I think Dave probably and Derek both have some better suggestions than I do. So,
Well, thank you for that, Sam. How about you, Dave? You have 1 minute.
Yeah, Sam's really caught that essence of that. It's how can we engage especially the urbanite to support prescribed burning and smoke emissions? And I think one way they've done this in Florida successfully is say, okay, you're going to have smoke, but we can control the amount and the duration of particulate matter with prescribed burning. And that's been a really successful public campaign. And it's taken a lot of public engagement to do that. And there's a lot of people down there. So you have huge amounts of impact on the public.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dave. Smoke is definitely part of our considerations for sure. Derek?
Well said. And it sounds cliche, but to continue to do things like this, right? Talk to one another. And then, if we burned 100 fires and one of them escaped, that's the one that's on the front page of the paper. But we might have missed 99 opportunities to tell a story about a successful collaboration. And those urbanites may not want to hear that it's good for cattle. So we've got to articulate the other, potential benefits. And I think really understanding the wildlife responses down to smaller things like amphibians or some of these songbirds that can resonate with people. So, the onus is on us folks that think fire belongs in the landscape to tell that story, those 99 positive stories to counter the one. And it's a good story. It's a great story,
Brilliant. Well, we'd like to say thank you so much to Dr. Dave Engle, Dr. Sam Fuhlendorf, and Dr. Derek Scasta for joining us from across the US all the way to here in Northeast BC. And perhaps you three could just stay on the line once everybody's closed out here. And we really would like to say thank you to all of you who participated, folks from BC Wildfire Service, helicopter pilots, Agriculture Canada, government, and producers. And I'll hand it over to Nadia.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we had some late joiners who maybe had their time zones mixed up, but don't worry, we have this webinar recorded. You can access that through the Peace Research Association website. And again, a big, big thank you to our three panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing a little bit of your expertise. Really appreciate it. And I did put a link if you haven't signed up yet for the third of the webinars in the three-part webinar series on prescribed fire in the Peace region. Join us for that. So the third webinar will be a producer panel. It will be on February the 13th in the evening at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So if you're in Dawson Creek or Fort St. John, that's your time right now. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day.